People, technology, service. Zenith Bank, in your best interest.
This is the result of one single blast.
3.3 million Ukrainians have now fled this country.
You don't have to go far to find a family who has been displaced.
We just heard an air raid siren ring out.
We run down to cover. It is hard to imagine life returning here.
In Kiev, Dnipro,
Poland.
This is CNN.
Taking on Putin, President Biden says Vladimir Putin cannot remain in power, as Ukraine says the West is not doing enough. With Russia claiming a shift in strategy, what does Ukraine need to survive? Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S., Oksana Markarova, will be here. And it's coming. The president tells U.S. companies to protect themselves against Russian cyber threats.
Russia's cyber capacity is fairly consequential, and it's coming.
What more do we know? And is America prepared? Senate Intelligence Chairman Mark Warner and House Foreign Affairs Ranking Member Michael McCaul coming up. Plus, lasting legacy. The first woman to lead the State Department, Madeleine Albright, has died. She opened up about making history in one of her final interviews.
I really did get enamored of understanding what democracy was about.
Hello, I'm Dana Bash in Washington. You're watching a special 2-hour edition of State of the Union. President Biden wakes up at the White House this morning, home from an emergency meeting with NATO allies in Europe. In Biden's closing speech on Saturday in Poland, he surprised onlookers and said, actually his own aides were surprised as well, when he said, "My God, Vladimir Putin cannot remain in power." That was an ad-libbed line that the White House immediately said he did not mean it, and he did not mean that he wants regime change in Russia. While NATO leaders used the summit to showcase their unity against Russia, Ukraine was not satisfied with the meeting, saying that the West is not doing enough to help them fight the war. That continued this weekend when Russian missiles attacked Lviv, actually outside of Kyiv, even after Russia said it would pursue a new strategy of focusing on the Donbas area of eastern Ukraine. That's a retreat, potentially, if it happens, and it could be a shift in the deadly and destructive conflict. I want to go straight to Lviv, where CNN international correspondent Phil Black is live. Phil, Russian missile strikes hit there yesterday. Tell us what happened.
So, Dana, this was significant because it was the first time that strikes have taken place within the crowded city limits here of Lviv. There were multiple strikes on 2 locations. One, a fuel depot, which created this huge fire, which emergency workers have fought through the night, eventually extinguishing not long after daybreak. The other site, according to Ukrainian officials, they describe only as military infrastructure. The Russians, in claiming responsibility for this, say that it's a radio repair plant that was being used to modernize Ukrainian weapon systems. These took place very close to people's homes, and yet, fortunately, no one was harmed. There is a theory put forward by some Ukrainian officials that this was meant as a signal to President Biden, who at that time was on the other side of the Polish border, the Ukrainian-Polish border, which is not far from here. But this does fit a broader pattern of Russian attacks, I should say, on Ukrainian logistics and supply and support locations, using their cruise missiles to hit specific points that are supporting the Ukrainian military defense. This was the 3rd fuel depot to go up in flames in recent days. The other key dynamic that's been established this week, Ukrainian counteroffensive operations. Most recently, we are seeing those around the eastern city of Kharkiv. We have video which shows Ukrainian forces pushing Russian forces back, involved in some pretty intense firefights at one point in a village around 12 miles east of that city. We're also hearing reports and seeing evidence of counteroffensive a little further north in the region of Sumy, and all of this builds on the counterattacks that have taken place around the capital, Kyiv, over the course of this week, to the west, to the northwest of the capital, and to the east as well. All of this shows that Ukrainian forces, wherever possible, are shifting their operations from not just fiercely defending their land to going on the counterattack and clawing territory back from Russian forces. Dana.
Well, Black, thank you so much for that report. And joining me here is the Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S., Oksana Markarova. Thank you so much, Madam Ambassador, for joining me. So I want to start with what you saw in Europe, specifically the NATO meetings this past week. Are you satisfied with what you heard coming out of the trip? Is the West doing enough?
Well, I think it's very important that West is united. And it's very important that the U.S. and President and administration and Congress are leading this effort to support Ukraine, to sanction Russia, and to stop Putin. Now, enough will be when Putin will be stopped. So as we always say, we're very grateful for everyone, especially for the United States, for all the support. But since Putin is increasing this attack, since Putin is increasing all the atrocities on the ground, killing innocent civilians, we all together have to do more. We have to stop him.
An advisor to President Zelensky described NATO's response to Russia's invasion as an appeasement. Do you agree with that characterization?
We definitely are reliving this 1939 moment. And I think we all have to understand that, it's not only about Ukraine. And the reason why Putin attacked Ukraine is, of course, because he wants to eliminate us as a free democratic neighbor. But it's also because he hates everything that is democratic. That he would like to destroy anything that is not autocratic and that cannot be occupied. So it's up for all of us to understand that we have to stop it. And in order to stop it, we never ask the boots on the ground, but we ask all the civilized countries to provide us with all the tools necessary in order not only to defend us, to defend Europe, but also to stop it and stop this war.
The President Biden, said that Vladimir Putin cannot remain in power. The White House walked it back, as you saw, saying the U.S. does not support regime change. What's your reaction to this?
Look, it was a great speech of President Biden. He clearly said that U.S. is and will be with Ukraine in this fight. And we really appreciate it. And we would like everyone to be with us in the most possible ways. Now, we all understand and we see it and say, I would like to thank all journalists for spreading the truth and showing for what it is. It's a brutal aggression of a neighboring country, of a peaceful neighbor that never posed any threat unless being democratic is a threat. Russia attacked us in 2014. They started full-fledged war 33 days ago. They're killing civilians, killing children, destroying our hospitals, civilian infrastructure, residential homes, everywhere. It's an act of war criminal. That's why we have opened investigation in Ukraine. That's why Ukraine submitted all the application to all international courts. And yes, Vladimir Putin, together with everyone, every Russian that is responsible for it, will have to end up in jail for these war crimes. So yes, he has nothing to do to lead a state if Russia would like to be a democratic or even a civilized state.
So you're saying that there should be regime change?
Well, it's clear to us that Russia is a terrorist state led by a war criminal. And we are working day and night and fighting fiercely to defend our land and to defend our democracy. And everyone should be brought to justice. So I think it will be difficult to run a state from The Hague.
Madam Ambassador, Russian military officials are starting to signal a potential shift in strategy, focusing on Crimea and the two regions of the Donbass. Are there any circumstances in which the Ukrainians would give up those areas in order to make a peace agreement with Russia?
First, we can always count on Russia lying. They lied before the war that they will not start the war. They lied in 2014 that they did not attack us when they illegally occupied Crimea and Donetsk and Lugansk. And they are lying during the past 33 days about not attacking civilians, about not besieging Mariupol and killing people there, about not kidnapping people and taking them into Russia, what they are doing, and all of that. So I think the signals that we hear from Russia merely comes from the fact that they were not able to do anything that they have planned to achieve, either blitzkrieg, taking over Kyiv, nobody is greeting them with flowers, and all Ukrainians are defending the country and telling Russians go home. So they're just simply lying, as Solzhenitsyn say, and we all know they lie. Now, on the question of, I don't even think we should be asking Ukraine what we are ready to give up. You know, we are fighting for our country. The territorial integrity and sovereignty of any country is enshrined not only in the Statute of UN, but should be enshrined in every heart and mind of anyone who believes in democracy. So after this brutal aggression, we are, of course, are ready to negotiate, and we are negotiating the humanitarian corridors, and we are ready to negotiate a peace agreement. But the peace agreement should include them leaving our territory, all of it. And no, we are not ready to give up on some of our people or some of our territories and leave it under occupation, because occupation, as we see now, as we saw in 1932 during the Holodomor, as we saw in previous times when Russia occupied us, occupation for Ukrainians means extermination of us.
Your job, most of your job here in Washington, is to try to get more funds, more weapons from Congress and from the administration. Have you received pushback on getting the missiles, the defensive missiles that you're asking for, that President Zelensky asked for again just yesterday?
I think we have very constructive talks here, and we're trying to convince all of our partners, and especially here in the US, that in order for the civilized world to stop this war and win this fight, because it's not only a fight for Ukraine, all of us are at risk, we need all weapons, especially those that will enable us to protect our skies. We need much stronger sanctions. We need to sanction all of Russia's financial system, all of their banks. We need, all the support we can get, because it's not only about Ukraine. It's about aggression by a brutal dictator, by a nuclear power that attacked the only country, Ukraine is the only country, that voluntarily got rid of the third largest nuclear arsenal, which we used to have in 1994, in exchange for guarantees, we thought, as it turned out to be assurances, from Russia, from the US and Great Britain.
So, okay, thank you so much, Madam Ambassador. I really appreciate you coming on and talking with me this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to all Americans who are helping us on this fight.
Thank you. And experts are surprised that Russia doesn't appear to have launched major cyber attacks against the US. But could that change? Senate Intelligence Chairman Mark Warner is here next. Plus, really terrible news for women and girls in Afghanistan this week. Is there anything the U.S. can do about it now? Congressman Mike McCaul is coming up.
Today, we live in an unpredictable environment, and news races around the world at breakneck speed.
Our engine continues, our impetus, our momentum.
My show brings you the latest news and top news makers. Give me the facts on voter fraud.
There has never been a moment where voter fraud has affected the outcome of an election.
And we also dive below the headlines to explore vital issues impacting our lives.
Normally this theatre would be filled with people and art and debate and energy, and so now we have to rely on the two of us.
How interesting is it to be Tyler Mitchell today? It's crucial we make sense of what's happening. There seems to be some confusion that maybe you can clear up. Where are the US forces in Syria going? And fully understand what's at stake.
What's happening now in the world is a great thing, because people are talking about subjects they never did before.
Amanpour, weeknights on CNN.
World Sport.
World Sport.
For World Sport, I'm Amanda Davis.
I'm Patrick Snell. I'm Alex Thomas.
I'm Coy Wire.
I'm Don Riddell.
I'm Andy Scholl.
And this
is CNN.
At Garnier, we are investing a lot in green sciences. We think this is the future, green tech and biotech that really allows us to bring performance and innovation for the consumer whilst being more sustainable. And I really believe this move is going to happen across the industry, in beauty, but also outside of beauty, because at the end of the day, it's one of the solutions, to the climate crisis.
Because for a long time, people, we talked about greenwashing, we talked about communication, but in the end, what you're saying is that companies are moving more towards actual technologies that are going to allow them to be green in a way that is both profitable and good for the consumer.
Yeah, green is a very serious topic, you know, and it's all about science and delivering performance. And you're right that sometimes, you know, people were referring to greenwashing, but we can prove people with the science and how we actually do things and improve the footprint of our products with very clear numbers. And this is really, I think, the big challenge for us and the whole industry.
I'm Barry Hurst, Energy and Sustainability Director at Schneider Electric. Schneider Electric was ranked the world's most sustainable company in 2021 by Corporate Knights, and it drew a lot of attention to what we've been working on now for over 10 years. So I think the important thing to emphasize is that it's a long-term commitment and that it takes a lot of organization to really make big strides. So the advice I would give is do strategy and action in parallel. We see a lot of companies who have a strategy but are unsure on how to implement it, and we see companies that want to get action but don't have a clear strategy. So I would say always do the two in parallel if you want to get maximum impact and really accelerate your journey.
In a special ongoing season of the Tug of War podcast, CNN reporters are on the ground in Ukraine, documenting Russia's invasion, the escalating conflict, and what it means for the rest of the world. Tug of War. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to State of the Union. This winter, as President Biden warned that Russia was planning an attack on Ukraine, one of the big fears here at home was cyber attacks. That hasn't happened on a large scale yet. Here with me is the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Senator Mark Warner of Virginia. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask you about cyber in a minute, but first let's talk about the president's big speech yesterday in Poland. He said many things about autocracy versus democracy, but then he ad-libbed at the end saying that Vladimir Putin cannot remain in power. The White House has clarified that since, saying that the administration does not support regime change. Do you think that statement did any damage?
Well, Dana, there is one individual that's trying to make regime change in Europe, and that's Vladimir Putin trying to change the regime in Ukraine. And I candidly agree with the Ukrainian prime minister, who really has been extraordinary. We, and not just we, but countries around the world have called out Putin as a war criminal. He has been sanctioned by many, many nations. We're trying to kick him out of the G20. Now, at the end of the day, the regime in Russia will be determined by the Russian people. And I hope the Russian people will make those decisions going forward. Clearly, Putin has overplayed his hand in Ukraine. Russian forces are reeling. And I think that's partially because they know they are involved in an illegal war. But it'll be up for the Russian people to make that decision. One thing also that I think that the Ukrainian ambassador made clear, and I see this as I travel around Virginia, this is so much bigger than a war between Russia and Ukraine. What the Ukrainian people in many ways are doing are fighting with their lives for the kind of basic freedoms that we take for granted. Freedom of the press, freedom to agree and disagree, having your votes counted. I hope we all as Americans realize what is at stake here and continue to show this united support for Ukraine.
But as a senior American elected official, do you believe that the stated policy should be regime change in Russia or not?
I think that the stated policy, as the White House has pointed out, has not changed. It is up to the Russian people to determine who is going to be in power in the Kremlin. But we have someone who has put Russia into the status of a pariah nation, who most of the civilized world has called out as a war criminal. And clearly the Russian troops are not performing as if they were following a legitimate approach.
So let's talk about cyber. You have been warning for years, screaming from the rooftops about cyber attacks. President Biden said this week that Russia's cyber capacity is, quote, fairly consequential, and it's coming. Can you describe what Russia and what their plans vis-a-vis a cyber attack on the U.S. would look like on businesses, on infrastructure, on government?
Well, let's break this into two categories. I mean, first of all, we do know the Russian cyber capabilities are top-notch. We've been the victim when we see the Russian cyber criminals, like the Colonial Pipeline that had us have gas lines a year ago, and many, many other Russian cyber attacks. The first thing I've been surprised at is that the Russians have not launched their A-team cyber attacks against Ukraine. It's remarkable to me that the internet is still operating and that world press is still getting these images out of Ukraine. I was horribly afraid that Russia would come in and shut down all the power systems, shut down the internet, and that some of those cyber tools would bleed into eastern Poland and literally potentially shut down power.
Why haven't
there.
they? Haven't they?
We don't honestly have a good answer yet.
Really?
And
The U.S. intelligence
I don't think it's
doesn't
lack
know?
of capability, but this is a question that we are constantly posing. Now, did they think they were going to win too easily? Some of these cyber tools, when you put them into the wild, they don't respect geographic boundaries. You don't really know what would happen with cyber escalation. Maybe they've been saving them to use against us. So I do think President Biden is correct in saying Americans need to be ready. We have increased our shields. Finally, Congress passed a law that he signed that requires if you are attacked in a cyber domain, you got to report to the government so we can share with private sector partners. But I think particularly in the finance sector and the energy sector, we need to be prepared because an A-tier offense can oftentimes overcome a defense. The question is, how quickly can we then stand back up our systems?
So you say Americans need to be prepared. If Russia does launch a cyber attack against America or any NATO country, would that trigger Article 5, which is an attack on one NATO country is an attack on all, and would that require a response?
Well, there are cyber attacks from Russia and China going on a daily basis for years.
So when and how should the U.S. respond?
In terms of literally causing loss of life, there's always been what we call strategic ambiguity about what is defined as an Article 5 violation. I think that is still an appropriate grayness at this point.
When does it become unambiguous?
Well, I think that was what I was afraid of. If they'd shut down the systems in Ukraine and it bled into eastern Poland and hospitals were shut down and Polish citizens were dying, or American troops were in some kind of accident because the power systems go down and American troops are killed because of the reaction to a cyber attack, that gets us into an area where we are, again, in uncharted territory.
Crypto, one of the major concerns, is that Russia might be able to evade Western sanctions by using cryptocurrency. You just introduced a plan to try to stop Putin from doing that. Do you think that that is an active strategy right now in Russia?
I think digital currencies and distributed ledger have a great opportunity, but it's really very opaque at this point. For example, right now there are 10 major crypto exchanges around the world. 2 of them are based in America. So when we put our sanctions regime in place, those crypto exchanges got covered. The other 8 didn't. And what I'm worried about, whether the foreign crypto exchanges or what's called DeFi, decentralized finance, which is the wild, wild west, that Russian leaders, oligarchs can find ways around some of our sanctions. So we're trying to simply put some rules in place, not to be against cryptocurrencies per se, but to make sure that they are not bleeding out their wealth through those tools.
Mr. Chairman, before I let you go, we are understandably very focused on Ukraine and on Russia, but I want to ask a question about Afghanistan, because the Taliban blocked girls above 6th grade from returning to schools on Wednesday, and that just happened just hours after schools were supposed to reopen for them. The State Department called it a betrayal. A top U.S. diplomat said, frankly, it caught us by surprise. Did it catch you by surprise as the intelligence chairman?
Nothing the Taliban does catches me by surprise. This is a brutal, awful regime. I saw some of the reports of girls terribly disappointed not being able to return to school. We need to keep the pressure on. I'm very proud of the fact that we in Virginia are actually, here in Loudoun County, are the place that is continuing to take in Afghan refugees. We're literally have gotten 130,000 people out of Afghanistan. We need to continue to make sure those refugees get a chance to resettle in America and around the world.
Senator Mark Warner, chairman of the Intelligence Committee. Thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you. And a top Republicans' take on the emergency NATO summit. Is the U.S. doing enough to help Ukraine? Congressman Michael McCaul will be here with me next.
We are on a mission to transform our continent and empower African trade to thrive by accelerating the next generation of African businesses. We can grow stronger, trade further, and transform together. We're bringing Africa together. Afrexim Bank, transforming Africa's trade.
Bringing together thought leaders and policymakers under the banner of diplomacy, dialogue, and diversity, Doha Forum will reconvene for its 20th edition in March 2022 to discuss transforming for a new era.
A Mediterranean diet offers a number of health benefits. Here are some easy steps to start your journey into the Mediterranean style of eating. Cook with extra virgin olive oil instead of butter, margarine, or refined oils like soybean and canola oil. Add foods rich in healthy fats to recipes and snacks. These include sunflower seeds, nuts, olives, and avocados. Choose whole grain bread and pasta instead of the refined varieties, and eat less red meat. Instead, add fish and other seafood to a few meals each week. Also, snack on lots of fruits and vegetables. Adding a starter salad to each meal is a great way to get more greens. Now for the beverages. Water should be your first choice. Also, switch from whole milk to a 1% skim or milk alternatives like almond milk.
I'm Nick Watt in Los Angeles, and this is CNN.
Welcome back to State of the Union. A top aide to Ukrainian President Zelensky says the West is not doing enough to help the country fend off Russia, saying they are disappointed in this week's emergency NATO summit. Here to talk about that and more is the top Republican on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Congressman Michael McCaul of Texas. Thank you so much for coming in, Congressman. So, President Biden is now here. He went to NATO and Poland, and he and his administration are touting the fact that he did present a united Western front with NATO. But after Ukrainian President Zelensky's historic speech to Congress last month, you said that history will judge us if we don't act now and if we don't act strongly. So in the aftermath of President Biden's speech, do you think that the United States is meeting the moment?
You know, I don't believe there are any deliverables that came out of this NATO summit, and that's my highest criticism. What Ukraine needs right now, and I talked to the ambassador right before the show, are these S-300 anti-aircraft missiles, like our Patriot batteries. Slovakia has these. I thought that by the end of this trip, they would announce that we're sending in all these S-300s into Ukraine to help them fight the good fight. This is like David and Goliath all over again. I was in Israel. We need to give David the slingshot. And what the slingshot really is the S-300. And that's what we're not giving them right now.
My understanding is that Slovakia has said yes, that country will give Ukraine their S-300s, which is an anti-aircraft missile system, but they won't do it until NATO supplies them with something to replenish their systems.
Correct. And so why wasn't that worked out in this trip? I mean, why did we pledge to give them our Patriot battery system, anti-aircraft battery system? What they want is a backup, just like with the MiGs in Poland. All they wanted were 2 F-16s. Why couldn't we have done that so we could send the MiGs into Ukraine? Why couldn't we do this with Slovakia and other Eastern European NATO allies to send more and more of these S-300s? You know, when they talk about no-fly zone, we can't do that. NATO can't do it directly. That will put us in direct conflict with the Russians. But we can give them the tools to create their own no-fly zone.
So I want to ask about President Biden's speech in Poland yesterday, saying that it seemed as though he was calling for regime change in Russia, saying Putin cannot remain in power. The White House, of course, walked that back, saying that is not the stated American policy. Was it a mistake for President Biden to say that? He ad-libbed it at the end of his speech.
Well, I think regime change is up to the Russian people. I agree with Senator Mark Warner that Putin is guilty of regime change in Ukraine. You know, and the fact is, anytime the United States has spoke out for a regime change, it hasn't worked out so well. That's not the policy of the United States here. Policy of the United States is to defeat the Russians in Ukraine. And you know, I know it was off the cuff, but whatever the president says it carries a lot of weight. When he said minor incursion, that carried a lot of weight. In this case, it sends a very provocative message to Mr. Putin. If we're so worried about provoking him that we couldn't even send MiGs into Ukraine, how is this any different? In fact, I would say it's more provocative than sending MiGs into Ukraine.
Was it appropriate for White House officials to walk that back?
I think so. Unfortunately, Dana, we're not talking about the issue at hand, and that is giving the Ukraine people what they need to fight this war. Instead, we're talking about the president's gaffe that he made at his speech.
I want to ask about China, because we heard this week from Chinese President Xi Jinping saying that the country would play a constructive role in brokering peace. What do you make of that? Do you see any evidence in China doing that at all?
I don't trust them. They're built on deception. Remember the Beijing Olympics, this unholy alliance, arm in arm, hand in hand, standing together, Mr. Putin and Chairman Xi, China, basically saying we have an unlimited partnership, denouncing democracy and freedom and territorial aggression. Xi calling out NATO aggression, Western aggression, Putin defending China with their ambitions with respect to Taiwan. The next shoe that could drop would be Taiwan. He is watching what is happening in Ukraine right now in terms of what is my calculus, what's going to be my next move in terms of Taiwan. We cannot make the mistake we've made in Ukraine and wait till after an invasion to arm them. We need to start arming Taiwan right now.
Afghanistan. This week, talked about this with Senator Warner, Taliban authorities in Afghanistan, suspended schooling for girls. You are a very vocal critic of the way the Biden administration handled Afghanistan. What is your response to seeing what the Taliban is doing, not allowing girls over 6th grade to get educated?
It's one of the saddest things I've had to witness. I think it's the ultimate betrayal. The way we left Americans behind enemy lines, Afghan partners behind enemy lines are being executed by the Taliban right now. But I think most and foremost, these girls and the women left behind in a society that they've never lived under Sharia law. So they don't know what that even means. And to see them getting pulled out of school because girls cannot be educated.
Is there anything America can do at this point?
We're helpless. I think we made the. I wanted a residual force. I didn't agree with giving up Bagram Air Base. We don't have any ISR capability. No eyes on the ground. We have little impact. I guess we could try to force the Taliban through other means to change this policy, but it's very difficult to do. This is very. It's so much of their culture. And again, it's one of the saddest things to watch.
Congressman, thank you so much for coming in. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Dana. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And Russia says it's turning its focus to a small region in the east. So is this a new strategy or just a distraction? We have a team of generals and Russia experts to break it down next.
We grew up in Indonesia, so we know our market really well. We started at the right time. We started with the right team. We started with the right motivation, and with luck, suddenly the country actually is ripe to digitalization and stuff. And there's a lot of investors' demand into the market that allows companies like us and others to be able to tap into those opportunities. True test of a company's sustainability is how the company can actually retain and continue to motivate the right leaders and people to actually join the cause. And we're so lucky and so humbled that we've continued to actually preserve that culture and core values that really kind of attracts the right people to navigate throughout the last 10 years and maybe for multiple 10 years to come.
I want this show, One World, to be a place where people watching from all corners of the globe can understand why what happens in Africa has a huge impact on all of our lives in ways we might never even know. Because of my background, I am well aware of the vibrancy of this continent, and I want to show that to the world. People of my continent do deserve to be heard. We are rich in ways beyond the soil beneath our feet.
One World with Zain Asher, weeknights on CNN.
Our mission here at CNN and journalists, the news comes first. That's when your heart beats a little bit faster.
More breaking news that we are following right now.
You really work as hard as you can, getting the facts.
We're learning more about an alleged plot.
It is critically important.
To our viewers in the United States and around the world, welcome to the Situation Room. We have breaking news.
This is the result of one single blast.
3.3 million Ukrainians have now fled this country.
You don't have to go far to find a family who has been displaced.
We just heard an air raid siren ring out.
We run down to cover. It is hard to imagine life returning here.
In Kiev, Dnipro,
Poland.
This is CNN.
As Russia signals a possible shift in strategy in Ukraine, we have an extraordinary group of military and intelligence experts to discuss. Thank you all for coming. Director Clapper, I want to start with you and ask about the Russian military. And if you look on here, I'm going to show you where the Russian military is attacking on 4 fronts, starting with Kyiv, Kharkiv, in the Donbas area, and then up through Crimea. So the Russian general that we heard this week talk about the fact that the first phase of the Russian operation is almost complete, and then they turn to a more limited goal of Donbas. How do you read that move, especially given what I just showed on the map?
Well, I thought the press conference was kind of bizarro, Orwellian, little resemblance to what from what I read, is the actual fact. The heaviest concentration of Russian forces is still around Kyiv, and they're still active in the west, and I don't believe there's been any shift whatsoever to Donbas. So this is, you know, kind of fiction that we come to expect from the Russians.
Yeah, and I just want to emphasize what we're talking about here. This is the Donbas area, excuse me, here. And that is what the general, you're calling it fiction and Orwellian, right, what the Russian leader suggested, that maybe they would be okay with just that, or at least that would be the goal.
You know, I think someone else used the old expression about putting lipstick on a pig here, trying to recast what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, and from a military standpoint, the abject failure that they've engendered so far.
So, General Pittard, I want to go to a different map here and show our viewers and talk to you about where the Ukrainians are pushing back. They're pushing back to the northwest, out from Kyiv. So the question for you is, what do you make of the Ukrainians actually being able to, it appears to be taking back this territory?
It's really kind of neat to see that the Ukrainians have started what seems to be a counteroffensive. But you know, in combat, momentum ebbs and flows. And right now, at least on the tactical level and even some portions of the operational level, the Ukrainians are seizing the initiative and are gaining momentum. But let's remember, the Russian forces, though they have been stymied, certainly around Kyiv, have tremendous capability. And what they're doing right now is merely a tactical pause, I believe, going into the hasty defense until they can get reinforcements, whether it's from Belarus, whether it's from Russia, or whether it's even from Georgia. And they will consolidate what they have in Donbas and Crimea, and eventually will probably still attempt to take Kyiv and encircle Kyiv in the future.
And Beth Sander, what do you agree with General Clapper about what the Russians are trying to signal, potentially trying to signal, about limiting themselves to the Donbas region on the east? Or, meaning, do you think he's looking for an off-ramp, or is this a misdirection?
It could be eventually an off-ramp, a path to some sort of negotiated solution, but I don't think they're anywhere near that yet. And there's a reason that they haven't pulled forces back from Kyiv. They have to keep pounding the cities in order to try to force capitulation. But at the same time, there are limitations on how much they can get out of these reinforcements. They have lost a lot of people. So if you take any of these statistics, there aren't 15,000 people plus all of the injured people that they can get that are quality soldiers from any of these other out-of-area operations or from Belarus.
And I would say that's a concern because they'll become even more desperate in the future. And that's why the use of chemical weapons or other weapons of mass destruction could be utilized, and that's a concern.
Well, I mean, look, this is all a product of failure, right? Vladimir Putin has failed. His own spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, made that point to Christiane Amanpour this week. Not a single one of his objectives has been met. And so, in part, while they have lied at every step along the way, as General Clapper points out, what would even a plausible scenario for Putin to exit and claim victory of some sort mean? It might mean, well, we have created a statelet in the East. And in fact, there are talk that perhaps they'll have a new one of these bogus referendum in these mini states in the Donetsk and Luhansk region. Well, you can see a scenario where they have military operations there, where they try to close up and encircle the Ukrainian forces in the Donbass. At the same time, they create a political option. Again, this is a terrible scenario, by the way. This is not a good scenario because you're talking about the potential for a sort of North Korea, a South Korea. And is Ukraine ever going to accept that after the blood and the costs on Ukrainian lives and cities? I mean, it's very hard to imagine that what might have been acceptable before the war could possibly be acceptable now.
And what you're talking about, I believe, is the head of Ukraine's military intelligence saying this morning that Putin could be looking to carve Ukraine into two, similar to the Koreas, North and South. What do you think that there's any viability to?
I hardly think that I don't think the Ukrainians have become pretty set about things too, and I don't think there's any, at least right now, any realistic prospect of the Ukrainians agreeing to something, something like that, a North-South Korea kind of analog. Now, I guess you could have an armistice, which is still the case in Korea. The war there has never ended, even though the hostilities stopped in July of 1953, but it's still an armistice or a ceasefire. Maybe that's a possibility where they don't acknowledge de jure the de facto situation.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, when we look at the negotiated solution options here, we actually are further apart now than we have been, I think, weeks ago. And that's a big concern, is how do we get from here to some kind of end state? And maybe the armistice idea is potentially the only way you can see forward, because politically, Zelensky cannot agree to allow the eastern part of Ukraine to go with Russia.
I want to turn back.
It's really hard to see a Venn diagram that you could draw where the Ukrainians and the Russians go away happy. I just don't see that.
Well, from a military point of view, I wanted to ask you, General Pittard, you are suggesting a humanitarian no-fly zone over Western Ukraine. How would that work?
Right, it'd be a humanitarian assistance zone, and ideally under the auspices of the United Nations, but that may not happen, so it may have to be NATO and U.S. led, working with President Zelensky and Ukraine for carving out Western Ukraine all the way down to Odessa as a humanitarian assistance zone, which would take NATO troops, led by the U.S., on the ground doing peace enforcement missions, being prepared for combat, and also a no-fly zone over Western Ukraine. I think it's time that if we're really serious about taking care of refugees and making sure humanitarian assistance takes place, that is done.
Well, look, anytime that Vladimir Putin wants to send a message at this point, what is he doing? What he did yesterday, he sent missiles into Western Ukraine and to Lviv at the exact moment that President Biden was making his speech and appearing in Poland, just a few dozen miles across the border is Poland, right there from Lviv. And so Vladimir Putin right now has the ability to do that. But just to pull back, it is remarkable that more than a month into this war, Ukraine still has the ability to fly. Ukraine still, has the internet. It's interesting to see, why is it that Vladimir Putin has not done some of the things that we believe he certainly has the power to do?
And the flip side of that, General Clapper, is that U.S. intelligence, as a former DNI, thought that the Afghan people would fight back, and they didn't. And they thought that the Ukrainian people would not fight back the way that they are. What does that tell you about not just the resolve of the Ukrainian people, first and foremost, but the state of intelligence with regard to these battlefields?
Dana, what it tells me, and I'll acknowledge I'm being a little defensive here, but there's the old saw in intelligence about the difference between mysteries and secrets. Secrets are knowable facts. And mysteries, maybe not. And when you're trying to predict how military forces are going to perform once they get into hostilities, that's in the realm of mysteries. And so we have never, in going back to my war, Southeast Asia, we've never done a very good job of assessing will to fight in advance.
Yeah.
We've always underestimated the adversary, whether it was the Viet Cong or the Taliban. And here's another case of that where we didn't gauge the will to fight. We thought the Russians would do better, and we weren't apparently very confident in the Ukrainians. You know.
Very, very important lesson. Thank you all for your expertise and your insight. Appreciate it. And the world lost a champion of democracy this week. We have one of Madeleine Albright's very last interviews. That's next. Stay with us.
The Dangote Group stands at the forefront of African enterprise. Since 1978, we've touched the lives of millions of people by meeting their basic needs. Our belief in the promise of Africa has taken us into 14 African countries, with substantial investments that will propel the continent towards greater prosperity, promising jobs, improved standards of living, and economic growth. Dangote, for an empowered Africa.
Zenith El Primero. Now this is a watch with a story. It was launched in 1969, and the name El Primero means the first in Spanish, because it was among the first automatic chronographs. But a few years later, the brand is bought by Zenith Radio Corporation. Zenith, the American corporation, ordered Zenith, the Swiss watch brand, to stop producing mechanical watches, and so the El Primero disappeared. But one crafty employee named Charles Vermeaux hid the tools and all of the plans and designs. So when the ownership changed again in the 1970s, everything they needed to create the El Primero all over again was there. And in 1984, the El Primero roared back onto the stage, and again to the delight of the watch world.
Mainland China tolerates no signs of dissent whatsoever.
Are you anticipating dozens of people being prosecuted? Hundreds? Thousands?
Stories of mass internment camps have been trickling out.
Do you think you'll see your husband again?
This period of mourning is taking place in a real climate of fear. The humanitarian crisis that is unfolding in front of our eyes here.
This is one of the cells? Come on in here.
We're flying over ISIS front lines. This is the only protection we have. The nerves are still very much on edge. Firefighters have been battling this blaze for weeks.
What do you say to people who question climate change?
We need to do something now.
Ivan Watson, CNN.
I'm Matt Rivers in Ciudad Acuña along the U.S.-Mexico border. This is CNN.